Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity sits quietly beside you, and the mysteries of our past stretch out without hurry. Tonight's journey begins under skies that have been watching over this planet far longer than we have been telling stories about it. They've been here before we had cities, before we had calendars, before the first history book was ever written. If you let yourself imagine it, you can almost feel that same sky looking down on people we've never heard of. People who may have shaped the world you and I live in right now without leaving their name behind. It's not the sort of mystery that hides in shadows. It's not even necessarily about secrets. It's about something quieter, almost polite, the kind of mystery that stands in plain sight and waits for you to notice. Scattered across the surface of our world are clues. Some are etched in stone, some are carried in the patterns of old maps. Some hide inside myths that are told so often, no one remembers who told them first. And tonight, we're going to let our thoughts follow those clues toward a simple, but strangely powerful question. What if an entire civilization lived, thrived, and even shaped our world, and we've forgotten they existed? Before we start looking for those hints together, I'd like to take a moment and picture where you are right now. Maybe you're sitting somewhere quiet with a drink in your hand. Maybe you're unwinding after a long day, not quite ready to sleep yet. Maybe your eyes are half on the screen and half on something else in the room. I'd love to know what the sky looks like outside your window right now. If it's night where you are, maybe you can see a few stars. If it's day, imagine those stars still hanging behind the blue, waiting for their turn to be seen. Someone thousands of years ago might have looked at the exact same patch of sky and used it to decide when to plant their crops or when to set out on a journey. Those same stars might have been the guide for someone building a monument we still walk past today, without fully understanding why it was built in the first place. If you enjoy letting your mind wander through questions like this, questions that move slowly and don't need to be answered in a hurry, I'd be grateful if you liked this video, or maybe subscribed. It helps this small corner of calm find other people who might want to think about the past in the same way. When you think about history, you might picture it as a neat line, with events placed in order, like beads on a string. There's a start, there's an end, and everything in between is connected in a clear logical path. But that's just one way of seeing it. Another way is to imagine history as a layered picture. The top layer is the one we know, the names of empires, the inventions, the migrations. But beneath that, there could be layers we've barely begun to notice. One of those hidden layers might be a civilization older than we think possible. One that developed skills and knowledge that made their way into our world quietly, passed from hand to hand until their origin was lost. You can see the edges of this possibility in certain ruins. There are places where archaeologists agree the main structure belongs to a known culture, but the base it sits on, the foundation stones, don't match. Sometimes the blocks at the bottom are far larger than anything the upper builders would have used. Sometimes they're fitted together so precisely without mortar that we can't slip a blade between them, while the newer work above looks rougher by comparison. One explanation is that later builders simply reused older stones left by whoever came before. And if they did, it means those earlier builders were there long before we have names for them. This isn't limited to one location. It happens in different parts of the world. Walls where one part is a tidy, even pattern, and another part is made of huge, irregular blocks. Cities with layers that don't quite match in style or material. Each time, the question hangs in the air. Who built the first part? Before written language, the only way to preserve knowledge was through telling it, and each retelling was a chance for details to change. Without records, a few generations could pass, and a major event could shift from remembered fact to half-remembered story. From there, it could become a legend, and finally a myth, until the real people and the real events were invisible under the layers of storytelling. Archaeology works with what survives, and survival is uneven. An object might be buried for thousands of years in perfect condition, while something from the same time vanishes completely because it was made from a less durable material. If a civilization built mainly from wood in a wet climate, their cities might have dissolved back into the earth. If they wrote on something that rotted or burned easily, their words would be gone, so we're left with pieces. Sometimes those pieces don't fit the timeline we already believe. An object might seem too advanced for its age. A building technique might appear long before we think it should. When this happens, researchers face a choice. They can try to fit it into the known story. They can suggest the dating was wrong, or they can set it aside as something unexplained. But each of these objects, each of these structures, has a real origin, and in some cases that origin might point back to people we don't know about yet. If such a civilization existed, they might not have been massive empire builders. They could have been small groups spread across great distances, linked by shared knowledge rather than political borders. Instead of focusing on conquering territory, they might have specialized in navigation, farming, astronomy, or tool-making, sharing their discoveries in ways that allowed others to claim them as their own. Their influence might have been subtle. Maybe they traded seeds that became the basis for crops we still rely on today. Maybe they showed others how to shape stone so it would last for centuries. Maybe they passed along ways to measure the seasons, or track the stars that ended up embedded in religious or cultural traditions. If you think about it, influence doesn't need a name attached to survive. You might use a tool every day without knowing who invented it. You might follow a tradition without knowing its origin. Multiply that across thousands of years, and it's easy to see how an entire civilization could fade from memory while their impact remained. We also have to consider how much of the planet we haven't explored in detail. Large areas of the ocean floor are unmapped. Dense forests can hide ruins from satellites. Deserts have swallowed entire cities beneath sand. Even in places we think we know, surprises still surface. Sometimes road construction uncovers ancient walls just below the ground. Sometimes drought reveals buildings on a lake bed. Each time it happens, it's a reminder that we're still only scratching the surface of our own story. It's not impossible that we've walked over or sailed past the remains of such a civilization without recognizing them. Without context, a structure might look like a natural rock formation. A carved stone might be dismissed as a coincidence. An unusual artifact might be labelled as out of place and left in a museum storage room. The scale of what's left behind depends on how people lived. If they moved often, they might not have built monumental cities. If they blended with later cultures, their distinct style might have been absorbed until it was no longer recognisable. If they valued materials that decay naturally, then almost everything they made could be gone, except for the occasional piece that was buried or sheltered by chance. This is where the idea becomes more than just speculation. It changes how we think about progress. We like to imagine that human knowledge moves in a steady upward climb, but history shows us that knowledge can be lost. Skills disappear when they're no longer passed down. Entire fields of expertise can vanish in a few generations. If there was once a high point long ago, and it was followed by decline, later societies might have rebuilt some of that knowledge without ever knowing it was a rebuild. That possibility makes our surroundings feel different. It means that something as ordinary as the way a road curves could be part of a design first laid out by people who vanished before recorded history. It means that a farming technique in one part of the world might have roots in a place far away, carried there by hands we can't name. And once you start seeing the world this way, it's hard to stop noticing the patterns. A symbol carved into stone in one country looks almost identical to one found thousands of kilometres away. A specific kind of joint in woodworking appears in cultures separated by oceans. A story told to children in one language has nearly the same shape as one told in another, with only the names and details changed. All of these things could have happened independently, of course. Human beings often come up with similar solutions to similar problems, but sometimes the similarities are too precise to ignore. When they line up too well and they appear in places with no known connection, it opens the door to the idea that someone made that connection long before we realised it existed. And maybe they left more behind than we've noticed so far. Maybe the next big discovery won't be a giant ruin or a golden treasure, but a small, ordinary object that forces us to rethink an entire timeline. When you start to look for patterns, you realise that some of the oldest parts of our world don't speak loudly. They don't shout their existence in the way a towering skyscraper or a giant billboard does. They murmur. They let time soften their edges. They settle into the landscape until you're not quite sure whether you're looking at something made by human hands or by the slow work of wind and water. And that's often how they survive. Think about how a story can survive in a family. Maybe your grandparents told you something they heard from theirs, and over time the details got fuzzy. A name might have been forgotten. The place might have been changed to somewhere more familiar. A person might have been turned into a legend. By the time you hear it, it feels half real and half imagined. But somewhere, buried under those changes, there's a kernel of truth. The same thing happens to the memory of entire civilizations. Without writing, the main way to pass down history was to speak it, to turn it into something memorable enough to be told over and over again. And the easiest way to make something memorable is to give it drama. Make the heroes larger than life. Make the events more spectacular. Add a little danger or romance. Make it worth repeating. The trouble is that while the story becomes more entertaining, the details that were once historical facts start to bend. Over thousands of years, a perfectly ordinary leader can become a mythical king who ruled for centuries. A skilled navigator becomes someone who could command the wind. A city built by careful engineering becomes a place raised overnight by magic. What was once a straightforward history becomes part of the shared mythology of the culture, and after enough time, people stop asking if any of it really happened. This is where the whisper hides. Not in the parts of the story that are too fantastical to believe, but in the pieces that feel strangely practical. The parts that don't need magic to work, but seem oddly advanced for the time. Details like knowing when the rainy season will start, or how to predict an eclipse, or how to build something that will last for centuries without collapsing. Those details might be all that's left of the real knowledge passed down from people who were gone long before the storytellers even knew their names. Some researchers have spent their entire careers sifting through myths to find these practical threads. They compare stories from different parts of the world, looking for similarities that shouldn't be there. When two cultures separated by oceans tell a similar tale about a great flood, it might be dismissed as coincidence. After all, floods happen everywhere. But when the details line up too closely, it becomes harder to ignore. The same is true for stories about strange visitors, about sudden advances in technology, about cities that vanish under the sea. In some traditions, there are stories of beings who come from far away, teach important skills and then disappear. Sometimes they're described as gods, sometimes as wise strangers. Sometimes they have no description at all, only that they were different. These stories might be pure invention, or they might be the distant memory of contact with a group who had knowledge others didn't have yet. There's also the way certain symbols appear in places with no known connection. Spirals, for example, show up in art from ancient Ireland, in the petroglyphs of the American Southwest, and in the carvings of the Pacific Islands. Maybe the spiral is a natural shape for the human mind to create. It mirrors the patterns of shells and whirlpools and galaxies. But maybe it's also something that travelled from place to place long ago. Language itself can hold whispers. A single word in one language might have a twin in another spoken thousands of kilometres away, with a meaning that hasn't changed much. Sometimes these similarities are explained through known trade routes or migrations. Other times, the link is harder to trace. If a now-lost civilization travelled widely, teaching and trading, they could have left fragments of their language in the places they visited. Those fragments could be hiding in plain sight today, disguised as local words that no one realises have a much older origin. We also find whispers in the layout of ancient sites. Some align perfectly with the movements of the sun, moon, or stars. In some cases, the precision is so high that even modern engineers are impressed. How could people with simple tools have achieved that level of accuracy? Sometimes we find out they had clever, low-tech methods that worked remarkably well. Other times, we're still not sure. And in those cases, it's tempting to wonder whether they learned those techniques from someone else, someone who had already mastered them. The trouble is that for every tantalizing clue, there are dozens of more ordinary explanations. An unusual artifact might be the result of a known culture experimenting with new materials. A symbol found in two distant places might have been invented separately. A story about a vanished city might be a metaphor for something else entirely, and so the idea of an unknown civilization remains just that, an idea unless enough pieces appear to connect into something more solid. Still, the number of unexplained pieces grows slowly. Every year, new discoveries challenge our timelines. A site turns out to be thousands of years older than we thought. A tool shows up where it shouldn't be. A genetic study suggests contact between populations that were supposed to be isolated. These aren't wild fantasies. They're documented shifts in our understanding, brought about by evidence that forces historians and archaeologists to adjust the story. You might think this would mean we're getting closer to a complete picture, but the more we learn, the more we realise how much we don't know. For every question we answer, several more appear. How did they do this? Why did they leave that? Where did they go? Sometimes the answer could be simple. They didn't vanish. They just became part of the cultures that came after them. Their name might have disappeared, but their knowledge lived on. In other cases, they might have been wiped out by disaster, floods, earthquakes, disease, leaving only survivors who couldn't maintain the same level of technology. And then there's the possibility that they deliberately erased themselves from history. Maybe they left because they wanted to. Maybe they hid their presence because they believed it was safer for those who came after them to think the knowledge was their own. It's hard to imagine why anyone would choose to vanish, but there are hints in our own history that sometimes people walk away from what they've built. There are abandoned cities from known cultures that were left intact, with no signs of war or disaster. The people simply moved on. If an unknown civilization once did the same thing, the only record might be what they left behind, and if they didn't want to be remembered, maybe they made sure that record was hard to find. What's striking is how much this idea changes the way we look at familiar things. It means that what we see as the beginning of a culture's story might actually be the middle. It means that the great leaps forward in technology might have been steps back toward something that was once common knowledge. It means that the myths we think of as entertainment might be holding on to pieces of real history. And if that's true, then every ruined wall, every half-buried tool, every strange word in an old language becomes more than just a curiosity. It becomes part of a larger puzzle. When we think about puzzles, we imagine all the pieces in a box ready to be assembled. But with history, most of the pieces are missing. Some are in the wrong box. Some are so worn down you can't tell where they fit. The whisper before history is like the picture on the puzzle box that's been faded almost to nothing. You can still make out shapes, maybe a bit of colour, but not enough to be sure what the whole thing looks like. And yet, the faint outline is there. We just have to decide whether we're willing to look closely enough to see it, and whether we're ready for the possibility that the picture is nothing like the one we thought we were building. It's a question that can arrive quietly without warning. You might be standing in a museum looking at something so old it barely seems possible, or walking past a weathered stone in the middle of nowhere, and suddenly the thought appears. Who came before us? Not just in the sense of our immediate ancestors, but before the ones we think of as the first builders, the first farmers, the first navigators. Who shaped the path before recorded history began to keep track? Most of the time we answer it in the way we've been taught. We think about the earliest civilizations we've named, the Sumerians, the ancient Egyptians, the Indus Valley people, the early dynasties of China. We imagine the first city walls rising, the first ships setting out from sheltered bays, the first tools made from metal instead of stone. But that's only the story we've been able to piece together from what survived. It's the record after the record began. It doesn't mean nothing happened before that. Archaeology has shown us again and again that the human story stretches back further than we assumed. There was a time when the idea of people building monuments thousands of years before Egypt was considered impossible. Then we found them. Sites that predate the pyramids by millennia, built with skill that shouldn't have been possible for supposedly simple societies. Each time we push the timeline back, the gap between what we thought we knew and what we actually find gets wider. But there's another layer to the question. It's not just about when people first started doing certain things. It's about whether there were entire civilizations, complex, organised, advanced in ways we don't expect, that came and went before the cultures we already know about. Civilizations whose names we never learned because they were lost before anyone thought to write them down. If that sounds far-fetched, think about how quickly even our modern world could fade if it weren't constantly maintained. Stop taking care of a road, and nature will start breaking it apart within years. Leave buildings empty and they begin to decay in decades. Give it a few hundred years without repairs, and even the tallest structures could collapse into rubble. In 1,000 years, without people to preserve or rebuild, much of what we've made could vanish entirely. Now imagine the same thing happening to a civilization that existed thousands or tens of thousands of years ago. If they built in wood or clay in a climate that encouraged decay, the evidence would be gone. If they built in stone, some of it might survive, but without context it could be misidentified as something much younger, or simply dismissed as a natural formation. We sometimes underestimate how fragile the record of human existence really is. Fire, flood, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions and rising seas have erased entire chapters of our story. Places that were once thriving communities are now on the ocean floor. Fertile valleys have turned into deserts, burying settlements under meters of sand. In those places, the work of whoever came before us might be sitting just beyond our reach, waiting for the right conditions to be seen again. Even without natural disasters, there's another force that can erase the past. Us. Later civilizations often build directly on top of older ones, reusing the materials, changing the layout, and covering whatever came before. When you walk through an ancient city today, you might be standing on the foundations of something far older than the visible ruins. If we accept that possibility, the question becomes even more interesting. What if some of the innovations we credit to known civilizations were actually passed down from an earlier forgotten one? Maybe they didn't invent the idea from scratch. Maybe they inherited it, refined it, and made it their own without knowing its origin. That kind of inheritance doesn't have to be deliberate. If people trade or migrate, they bring their skills with them. They might teach others, or others might watch and learn, and the technique spreads. After a few generations, the source is forgotten. The skill is simply part of life, and everyone assumes it's always been there. There's also the question of a knowledge that seems to arrive too early. Every so often, we find evidence that people were doing something far ahead of what we thought possible for their time, building with precision beyond the tools we think they had, navigating in ways we didn't believe they could, understanding astronomy or engineering at a level that seems to belong to a much later period. Sometimes we figure out how they did it and realise they were simply more resourceful than we gave them credit for. But other times, the explanation doesn't quite fit. When that happens, the easiest response is to say it was a coincidence, or to assume the dating must be wrong. But the harder, more intriguing possibility is that they weren't the first to know how. It was the knowledge handed down from someone else who had already mastered it. Oral traditions sometimes hint at this. There are stories in many cultures about learning from outsiders. Strangers who arrived from distant lands or across the sea taught something important and then left. In some cases, those strangers are described as gods. In others, they're just unusual people. The details vary, but the pattern is there. Someone comes, shares knowledge, and disappears. It's not proof, but it's worth noticing when similar stories appear in places with no known contact. It suggests the possibility that they're remembering the same kind of event, even if the names and descriptions have changed over time. We also have to think about the gaps in the record. For every ancient site we've uncovered, there are countless more still hidden. Thick jungle can hide stone walls and pyramids for centuries. Shifting sands can cover entire cities. Ice can lock away settlements that once sat in green valleys. The ocean can claim everything along a coastline in a single rise of sea level. Some of these hidden places will eventually be found, just as we've uncovered lost cities in the past. Others might remain unreachable, but the fact that they exist means our current understanding is based on a fraction of the whole picture. And if that's true, then asking who came before us isn't just an idle thought. It's a real question with real weight, because whoever they were, their lives shaped the foundation we're standing on now. Maybe they didn't think of themselves as remarkable. Maybe they were just living their lives, solving problems, building things, raising families. But the choices they made, where to settle, what to grow, how to work with the land, could have echoed for thousands of years. If an earlier civilization domesticated a plant that became a staple crop, we might still be eating their legacy every day. If they developed a method for shaping stone, later builders might have copied it without knowing where it came from. If they mapped the stars, their knowledge could have been folded into the astronomy of later cultures. In that sense, asking who came before us isn't just about finding ruins or artifacts. It's about understanding the quiet ways influence travels through time. It's about realizing that our story might be longer and more complicated than we think, and that somewhere in that unseen past, there could have been people whose fingerprints are still on the world, even if their names are gone. Before we go further, I'd like to ask you something small, something easy, and something that helps keep this sort of journey possible. If you're enjoying this slow drift through questions that don't demand immediate answers, if you like wandering through ideas that stretch beyond what's written in history books, it would mean a lot if you gave this video a like, or maybe subscribed. It's a small gesture, but it helps more than it looks. It helps this quiet space find others who might want to think about the past without rushing to conclusions. I'm not asking for it because numbers matter here in the way they do in most places. I'm asking because the more people who join in, the richer these conversations can get. The more minds considering the same questions, the more perspectives there are. Sometimes it's the smallest comment from someone in a completely different part of the world that changes how you think about something. Sometimes it's hearing from someone who's lived near an archaeological site their whole life and has seen things that never make it into research papers. And other times it's simply the reassurance that you're not the only one who enjoys asking questions without the expectation of tying them neatly with an answer at the end. There's also something reassuring in knowing that there are others moving through this same moment with you, even if you're scattered across time zones. Right now, someone could be listening from a city apartment with traffic humming below. Someone else might be in a rural town where the night air is still enough to hear crickets outside the window. Someone could be halfway across the world, listening with their morning coffee while you're winding down for the evening. We've talked about the idea of people who came before us, people whose lives shaped ours in ways we may not realise. Well, that same ripple effect happens in the present too. What you choose to share, who you talk to about it, what questions you pass along. All of that can change how others see the same subject. You might think that pressing a button to like or subscribe is just an interaction with a screen, but it's really the smallest first step in a chain of events you can't fully see. It's the modern equivalent of adding one more voice to a campfire conversation that's been going on for hours, where someone new sits down and hears a story for the first time. And speaking of that campfire image, I think about how in earlier times, that was one of the main ways knowledge travelled. There were no recordings, no written archives in most places, just people passing information directly. If you wanted to be part of it, you had to show up and listen. And by showing up, you became part of the memory. In a way, that's still what happens when you decide to stay with a conversation like this one. You're here, you're listening, and in doing that, you're part of the process of keeping an idea alive. You might be listening because you've always been fascinated by history. or because you like the idea that there's more to our past than what's commonly taught. Maybe you just enjoy the pace, the calm, the chance to slow down your thoughts while hearing about something larger than the day-to-day routine. All of those reasons fit here. What's interesting is that when people come together around a topic like this, it often leads to more than just thinking about the past. It shapes how we see the present too. If we consider that unknown civilizations might have influenced our world in subtle ways, we start to notice other kinds of influence happening right now. We see how ideas spread, how innovations are shared and adapted, how a practice that starts in one small corner of the world can end up being used everywhere without anyone remembering where it began. Even in this moment, you might have habits, preferences, or bits of knowledge that came to you from sources you've never traced. Maybe you cook a recipe the way your parents did, without realizing it came from their parents, and from someone before them, and so on. Maybe you listen to a style of music that travelled through cultures and decades before it reached your playlist. It's the same with technology. The device you're using now is the result of countless people's work. Most of them you'll never know by name. And that's part of why I think these conversations matter. When we open ourselves up to the possibility that our world is built on the foundations of people we've forgotten, we also open ourselves up to appreciating the unseen contributions happening all around us. We start to realise that the present isn't just happening in isolation, it's part of a much longer chain, and what we do now will eventually become part of someone else's starting point. There's a reason I'm bringing this up before we get into the details of the mystery itself, because once we start digging into the possibilities, it's easy to get caught up in the specifics, the artifacts, the sites, the theories. Those are important, but they're easier to understand if you already have a sense of how influence can work invisibly over long stretches of time. When you've seen it in your own life, you can better imagine how it might have happened thousands of years ago. An influence doesn't need to be big to be lasting. A single tool design that works better than anything else can outlive the people who invented it by thousands of years. A way of building that makes structures stronger can be copied by others who have no idea where it came from. A story that inspires people to act differently can survive long after the reason it was told is gone. I think about that a lot when looking at old ruins. Not just the question of who built them, but whether the people who built them had any idea their work would last. Did they intend for it to survive this long, or were they just solving a problem for the moment? Maybe it doesn't matter to the structure's survival whether the intention was there. Maybe the same is true for the ideas we share now. So, yes, I'm asking you for something small, but I'm also pointing out that the smallest actions can be part of a much larger story. If you've ever heard the phrase planting a seed, you know the idea. You do something now that might grow into something much bigger later. The thing is, you rarely get to see the full result. But that doesn't mean it's not worth doing. That's the way I think about these conversations. Each one is a kind of seed. Each person who hears it takes something different from it. Some might pass it along to someone else. Some might think about it quietly for a while, before it connects with something else they've read or experienced. Some might forget about it completely until years later when something reminds them. There's no way to predict it, but the process is always happening, and now that you're here, you're part of it. Whether you've just arrived or you've been listening for a while, you've stepped into a moment that connects you to all the other moments this conversation has existed in. And the people who might come to it later will be connected to you, even if you never meet. It's not unlike how we think about those earlier civilizations. We don't know them, but we live in a world they helped shape. We don't know their names, but we still encounter the results of their decisions. In the same way, you might not know everyone who's ever listened to this, but you share a space with them in the same way we share the planet with those who came long before us. So, if you'd like to add your voice to that shared space in the smallest way, you know how to do it. And once that's done, we can turn our attention fully to the trail ahead. The scattered clues, the strange patterns, the unanswered questions that might lead us closer to understanding whether such a civilization existed at all. When we start looking for the past, we like to imagine it as something clean and complete. In our minds, the archaeological record feels like a carefully organised archive, each event stored neatly where it belongs. But in reality, it's nothing like that. It's more like a box of fragments, most of them missing, many of them jumbled together, and a good number of them so damaged that you can't tell what they once were. The story we build from those fragments is always partial, always stitched together from whatever's available at the time, and that means there are shadows, places where something should be, but isn't, gaps where an event clearly happened, but no evidence has survived to explain it, contradictions where one discovery says one thing, but another says something completely different. The archaeological record isn't just the physical remains, it's also the absence of them. And when you start paying attention to those absences, you notice patterns. Sometimes the pattern is geographic. Entire regions have been barely explored, either because they are hard to reach or because politics, conflict or resources make it impossible. Vast stretches of ocean floor have never been mapped in detail, even with modern technology. There are rainforests that hide structures under dense canopies, deserts that have swallowed whole cities, and mountain valleys that may hold settlements no one has ever documented. In those unexamined spaces, the possibility of finding something that changes the story is always there. Sometimes the pattern is chronological. There are periods in the timeline where the evidence seems to thin out, even though there's no reason to think people weren't living and building at the time. A few scattered objects might survive, a tool here, a shard of pottery there, but nothing that explains how those people lived, how they organised themselves, or where they came from. And then there are the anomalies. An object turns up in a layer of earth that's older than it should be. A building style appears far earlier than expected. A piece of technology shows up in a place where, according to what we think we know, it couldn't have existed yet. These finds are often called out-of-place artifacts, and while many of them have reasonable explanations, misdating, later intrusion into older layers, or simple misunderstanding, some stubbornly resist fitting neatly into the established picture. In the most cautious corners of archaeology, those anomalies are often set aside, not ignored completely, but not given too much weight until more evidence appears. And that's fair. One unusual find doesn't necessarily mean the whole story needs to be rewritten. But if enough anomalies appear, and if they start to form a pattern of their own, then they're no longer just curiosities. They're signs that something in our understanding might be incomplete. There are well-known examples of this, sites that turned out to be thousands of years older than originally believed, tools that suggest advanced craftsmanship earlier than expected, bones that imply humans were present in a region long before our timelines allow. Every time one of these is confirmed, the reaction is the same. First surprise, then a re-evaluation of the established history. But there's a step before that re-evaluation that's less talked about. Before the new understanding becomes part of the accepted story, there's often a period where the discovery sits in a kind of limbo. Some researchers take it seriously, others dismiss it as an error. And in that in-between space, speculation thrives. This is where the idea of an unknown civilization slips into the conversation, because if there's a cluster of advanced techniques or unusual artifacts appearing earlier than they should, one explanation, though not the only one, is that they came from a source we haven't identified yet, a source that might have been more developed than we thought possible for the time. It's worth remembering that history as we know it is written mostly from what survives, and survival is uneven. Things last longer if they're made from certain materials, if they're buried in certain kinds of soil, if they're kept in dry or frozen conditions. A building made of stone in a desert can last for thousands of years. A wooden structure in a humid forest might be gone within decades. So if a civilization worked mainly with materials that didn't preserve well, most of what they built could vanish without a trace. Even when things do survive, they can be hard to recognize. An ancient quarry might look like a natural rock face to someone who doesn't know what to look for. The remains of a settlement might be mistaken for random scatterings of stone. An earthwork might be dismissed as a hill or ridge. It's only when someone takes a closer look with the right tools and knowledge that the human origin becomes clear. And sometimes, even with that knowledge, the meaning is still uncertain. We can measure and date a structure, but we can't always say exactly what it was for. Was it a temple, a fortress, a storehouse, or something entirely different? Without records, without context, we're left to interpret based on what we know from other sites. And if this site doesn't match those others, then we're in guesswork territory. That guesswork is part of why the shadows remain. If we're not sure what we're looking at, we can't always connect it to the bigger picture. It might be an isolated curiosity, or it might be one piece of a much larger network that's mostly invisible. There's also the human factor. Archaeology isn't done in a vacuum. It's shaped by funding, by politics, by the personal interests of researchers, and by the limitations of available technology. Some places get studied intensively because they're easy to access, or because they fit neatly into the known timeline. Others are left for later, or not at all, because they're remote, dangerous, or simply not considered important. That means the archaeological record is not just incomplete, it's uneven. Some parts of it are overrepresented, others are barely touched. And in those underexplored areas, both in geography and in the timeline, could be the remains of people we've never heard of, who lived and worked and maybe influenced the cultures we already know. Every so often, a discovery hints at this. A structure built with techniques that appear too sophisticated for its supposed builders. An artifact made from materials sourced hundreds of kilometers away, suggesting trade networks we didn't think existed yet. A pattern in settlement locations that points to a shared knowledge of resources or defense strategies that no one is supposed to have had at the time. These hints are easy to dismiss if you're only looking at them individually. But when they start to cluster, when the same kinds of anomalies appear in different places and periods, they're harder to ignore. And that's where the shadows start to take shape. Not as proof, but as suggestion. You can think of it like a photograph with large portions blurred out. You can't see the details, but you can make out shapes in the blur. Something is there, even if you don't yet know exactly what. What makes this particularly challenging is that we don't know how much is missing. The shadows could be small, just a few isolated instances. Or they could be huge, representing entire civilizations that rose and fell before we have any record of them. Without more evidence, it's impossible to say for certain. And yet, every artifact pulled from the ground, every site uncovered, every test result that comes back with an unexpected date adds one more piece to the puzzle. Sometimes, the piece fits neatly into the picture we already have. Sometimes it changes the shape of the picture entirely. And sometimes it doesn't seem to fit anywhere, until years later, when a new discovery suddenly makes it make sense. It's that possibility that keeps researchers looking. Because while the archaeological record is made up of what we can see, it's also shaped by what we can't. And the shadows, frustrating as they are, might be pointing us towards something much bigger than we've imagined. If the written record is the loud, clear voice of history, then the stones are its quieter, older counterpart. They don't speak in sentences, they don't tell you names or dates outright, and they can't correct you if you misunderstand them. But they hold a kind of language of their own, patterns in the way they were shaped, clues in how they were placed, meaning in their scale and orientation. Sometimes this language is easy to read. We find inscriptions carved into stone in scripts we already understand. We can translate them, compare them to other texts, and get a direct glimpse into what the builders wanted us to know. But more often, the stones are silent in that way. They have no letters, no numbers, nothing that matches a known writing system. In those cases, their language is the work itself. The choices made in carving, the methods used to move and position them, the alignment to natural or astronomical markers. Even the most unassuming stone can tell you something if you look closely enough. A groove worn into its surface might show where a tool was used repeatedly. Chisel marks can reveal whether the work was done with metal or stone implements. The type of stone itself can tell you where it came from. sometimes from quarries hundreds of kilometres away. When you start piecing together these kinds of details, you begin to see the outlines of the knowledge the builders had. If the stones are perfectly level and tightly fitted without mortar, it means the builders knew how to cut and shape with extreme precision. If huge blocks were moved into place, it means they had ways of transporting and lifting weight that even today would take significant planning and equipment. And here's where it gets interesting in the context of an unknown civilization. Some sites contain stonework that seems far beyond the capabilities of the culture it's attributed to, based on what we know of their tools and techniques. In those cases, researchers sometimes suggest the builders had help, either from an earlier culture whose skills were inherited, or from a contemporary group we haven't identified yet. There are walls where the lower layers are made of enormous blocks, fitted so perfectly that you can't slide a piece of paper between them, while the upper layers are smaller, rougher stones clearly from a different time. There are temples built over foundations that seem older than the civilization that built the temple itself. And there are isolated blocks, carved with precision, lying far from any known quarry, as if they were once part of something much larger that has disappeared. Some stones carry markings that don't match any known script. They could be symbolic carvings, decorative patterns, or even functional instructions for builders. Without context, we can't be sure. Sometimes similar markings are found at multiple sites far apart, suggesting a shared tradition or common origin. Alignment is another part of the stone's language. Many ancient structures are oriented towards specific points on the horizon where the sun rises or sets at solstices or equinoxes. Others align with particular stars or constellations. These choices tell us the builders had a deep understanding of the sky and the cycles of time. They also suggest that astronomy was important enough to be built into the very foundation of their monuments. What's remarkable is how precise some of these alignments are. Achieving that level of accuracy requires careful observation over long periods, as well as the ability to translate those observations into construction. If you're already picturing a small, forgotten civilization with that kind of skill, you can see how their influence might have been passed along even if their name was not. It's also possible that the stones themselves were reused. If a later culture came across an abandoned site, they might have taken the best stones and built something new with them. In doing so, they might have erased part of the original design while preserving other parts without realizing it. That makes reading the language harder, because you're looking at a mixture of messages from different times. Some researchers focus on tool marks to untangle this mix. By studying the shape, depth, and spacing of marks left on stone surfaces, they can sometimes identify the type of tool used. If a site contains marks from tools that shouldn't exist in that period, it raises questions. Did the builders have access to more advanced tools than we thought? Did they inherit stones from an earlier group who did? Or is our dating of the site wrong? Then there are the mysteries that defy easy explanation. Giant blocks weighing dozens or even hundreds of tons cut and moved with apparent ease. Stones shaped with curves and angles so precise they would be challenging to reproduce with modern equipment on site. Surfaces polished to a mirror-like finish, using methods we don't fully understand. There's no need to jump to the most extreme explanations to be impressed by this. Even within the range of known human capability, some of these feats require ingenuity, organisation, and technical skill on a level that isn't common. If a now lost culture specialised in this kind of work, their creations could have been so enduring that they were adopted and incorporated by others long after they were gone. Stones can also speak through their wear. Erosion patterns can suggest how long they have been exposed to the elements, though this is tricky to measure. If a structure shows signs of weathering far beyond what we'd expect for its supposed age, it might mean it's older than we think, or that it was built using reclaimed materials from something older. Another subtle clue is the type of construction. Some styles of stonework appear in multiple regions that, according to conventional history, shouldn't have had contact at the time. Massive polygonal walls, for instance, appear in both the Andes and parts of the Mediterranean. Whether that's coincidence, independent invention, or the result of knowledge travelling between distant places is still debated. We also have to remember that some stones are no longer where they were originally placed. Earthquakes, floods, and human activity can move or topple structures, scattering their components. When those stones are later found, they might be interpreted as being in their original position when they're not. That can make reading their language even more complicated, because it's like trying to understand a sentence with all the words rearranged. In the absence of a written record, the stones are sometimes all we have, and while they can't give us dates or names, they can tell us what was possible and what was valued. They can hint at networks of knowledge, at shared traditions, at capabilities we didn't expect. And sometimes they can point us towards something larger. A single carved block found in isolation might seem unremarkable, but if the same type of stone and carving appears hundreds of kilometres away, it suggests a link. That link might be trade, migration, or shared cultural heritage, and if those links multiply, they can form the faint outline of a civilization we haven't officially recognised yet. The challenge is that stones can outlast almost everything else. They survive while wood rots, while cloth decays, while paper burns. That endurance is what makes them so valuable to archaeology. But it also means they're often divorced from the full context of their creation. They're like single words from a conversation that's mostly lost. Reading them takes patience and a willingness to accept that some parts of the story may never be clear. But every now and then a detail emerges, a familiar tool mark, a shared alignment, a distinctive pattern that lets you connect one site to another. And in those moments, it's possible to feel like you've heard a few more words of that ancient language. When we think about maps, we usually picture something fairly modern: paper charts, digital screens, neat lines marking coastlines, rivers, and borders. Maps feel like products of recorded history, made once humans had the ability to measure distances and document them precisely. But every so often we find maps or fragments of them that seem to belong to a time before mapping should have been possible in the way we recognise it today. They don't look like the street maps in a phone app, but they show knowledge that suggests careful observation, repeated travel, and the ability to pass that information along in a way others could use. Some of these early maps are carved into stone, scratched into clay tablets, or painted onto walls. Others exist as descriptions in ancient texts that refer to places far beyond what the people of that time were supposed to know. There are maps that include islands we didn't officially discover until thousands of years later, or coastlines drawn in ways that match their appearance before the last ice age, when sea levels were much lower. How that knowledge existed at all is the question. In some cases, the answer might be coincidence, or the result of piecing together information from travellers over many generations. In others, the accuracy is harder to explain. You can imagine the effort it would take for a culture without modern surveying tools to chart hundreds of kilometres of coastline with precision, especially if they didn't have the benefit of aerial or satellite views. One of the most discussed examples is a map from the early 16th century that appears to show the coastline of South America in detail, along with a representation of Antarctica without its ice cover. Mainstream explanations suggest that it was a compilation of earlier maps, which themselves might have come from older sources. If that's true, then the question shifts from who made the 16th century map to who gathered that much earlier geographic knowledge in the first place. There are also indigenous mapping traditions that predate European contact and show remarkable accuracy. Some Polynesian stick charts, for instance, record the positions of islands, currents, and wave patterns over vast distances of open ocean. They aren't maps in the Western sense, but they function as highly effective navigational tools. The knowledge to make and read them had to be learned, practiced, and passed down over generations. If that tradition had begun earlier than we think, it could have mapped out enormous stretches of the Pacific long before outsiders arrived. Stone carvings in parts of Europe and the Middle East sometimes show layouts that appear to represent local landscapes, rivers, hills, settlements, drawn from a bird's-eye perspective, Without written explanation, we can't be certain, but the resemblance is striking. They hint that even without a formal cartographic system, people found ways to represent spatial information visually. The idea that maps could preserve knowledge far older than the cultures who used them is not far-fetched when you consider how human memory works. A detailed map could be copied and recopied, modified slightly each time, long after the original context was lost. Over centuries, it might pass through many hands, each adding their own details or interpretations, until the original maker's identity was completely erased. This is where the possibility of an unknown civilization enters the discussion. If we find maps, or map-like representations that show places in a level of detail or accuracy out of sync with the period they're from, it raises the idea that the information came from somewhere else, somewhere with the ability to gather it in the first place. Maybe that somewhere was a seafaring culture with wide trade networks, or a land-based civilization with skilled surveyors and a reason to document faraway regions. The problem is, maps are vulnerable. Unlike stone monuments, they don't survive easily unless they're carved or etched into durable material. Most early maps would have been made on organic materials, animal skin, cloth, bark, or paper, that decay quickly over time. Without protection, they're gone in a matter of centuries. That means for every ancient map we found, there could have been countless others that didn't survive. And yet, pieces do survive in unexpected ways. A map might be copied into a manuscript centuries later, preserving details from a much older source. It might be woven into a story, describing a route or a coastline with enough specificity that, when compared to modern geography, it matches real locations. It might even appear in myth, descriptions of lands across the sea or islands in certain positions relative to each other that later turn out to exist. We can't treat all of these as literal, but we also can't ignore the ones that line up too well to be chance. If 2 or 3 cultures far apart describe the same remote place with similar details, there's a chance they're drawing on the same route of information. Another intriguing angle is how some ancient structures themselves seem to serve as maps. Arrangements of stones, earthworks, or mounds can align to represent constellations or outline the shape of a region. In those cases, the map isn't something you hold, it's something you walk through. That kind of spatial representation suggests a deep understanding of both geography and symbolism, and a deliberate intention to preserve it physically. It's also worth noting that our own mapping of the world is still incomplete in certain areas. Large portions of the ocean remain only roughly charted, and even some land regions have minimal detail beyond satellite imagery. If a civilization with strong navigational skills existed thousands of years ago, they could have known things we're only rediscovering now, not because they had advanced technology in the modern sense, but because they invested generations into exploring and recording what they found. The preservation of maps, like any form of knowledge, depends on more than just the materials they're made from. It depends on whether they're valued, whether they're copied, whether they're taught. If an unknown civilization did map significant parts of the world, their maps could have been handed down to other cultures who adapted them for their own use, not knowing how old the information truly was. And if that happened, it means that some of the earliest recorded maps we have might already be compilations of even older work. The traces of that older work could be hiding in features that seem out of place, accurate details of places supposedly undiscovered at the time, or geographic features shown as they would have looked under different climate conditions. Maps are more than just tools for navigation. They're statements about what's known and what's important. What's included tells you what the makers considered worth recording. What's left out tells you where their attention didn't reach, or perhaps what they didn't want others to know. In some cases, deliberate omissions could hide valuable knowledge from rivals, meaning the full picture was kept private while the public version showed only select information. If we ever do find a map that can be confidently traced to a civilization we don't recognize, it will probably not come with an easy label explaining who made it and why. More likely, it will be a small detail on a known map that doesn't fit. It will be the kind of thing you only notice when comparing it to modern geography and realizing that somehow they got it right before anyone thought they could. And in that moment, it wouldn't just be about the map itself. It would be about the network of knowledge behind it, the journeys taken, the observations made, the systems of passing that information along over years or centuries. A map is a destination in its own right, but it's also the end product of countless steps taken by people whose names are now lost. Myths have a strange way of surviving. They change shape, their details shift, their characters get renamed or replaced, but some part of their structure endures. A story told in one generation might be repeated by the next with small adjustments, then again by the one after that, until centuries have passed and the people telling it have no idea where it began. To them, it's just a part of their cultural fabric, something that has always been there. For a long time, myths were dismissed as nothing more than entertainment or primitive explanations for natural events. They were seen as evidence of ignorance, not as sources of historical information. But over the past century, researchers have started looking at them differently. While myths are not literal in every detail, they can preserve memories of real events, places and people. Memories so old they predate writing. If you strip away the layers of symbolism, you sometimes find that a myth describes something that could have actually happened. A flood story might be rooted in a real flood, even if the account has been magnified over generations. A tale about a city swallowed by the sea might echo the memory of a coastal settlement lost to rising water. A legend about visitors from across the ocean could recall genuine contact between distant cultures. What makes this important in the search for an unknown civilization is that myths can preserve fragments of history from times and places where physical evidence hasn't survived. A culture might forget the name of a place, but remember its distinctive features in story form. They might forget the exact date of an event, but remember its effects. Flood myths are among the most widespread. Almost every region of the world has them in some form. In some, the flood is sent by gods to cleanse the world. In others, it's a natural disaster that forces people to flee. In a few, it's both. The details vary: how long it lasted, how high the water rose, how people survived. But the core idea is the same: a great inundation that changes everything. If you compare these stories to geological evidence, some line up with known events like the sudden flooding of certain valleys at the end of the last ice age. Others are harder to match, but they still raise the question of whether they're describing events we haven't yet identified. If a civilization existed in a coastal area that is now underwater, its end could have been remembered in the form of a flood myth, passed down by survivors and absorbed into the oral traditions of other groups. There are also myths about lost lands, places like Atlantis in Greek tradition, or Kumari Kandam in Tamil stories, or Leoness in Cornish legend. Each is said to have been a large, prosperous land that disappeared, usually beneath the sea. Some of these could be entirely symbolic. Others might be exaggerations of smaller-scale events. But the persistence of the theme, the idea of a place that was there and then wasn't, suggests that something about it resonated across cultures. In some cases, myths preserve surprisingly specific geographic details. An island might be described as lying a certain number of days' journey in a particular direction, with distinctive mountains or a unique arrangement of rivers. Without maps, those descriptions had to be based on direct experience, either by the storytellers themselves or by people they learned from. That means even an obviously fictionalized myth could be rooted in a real place visited long ago. Stories about culture bringers are another category worth attention. In many traditions, there's a figure, sometimes a god, sometimes a hero, sometimes an unnamed stranger, who arrives from elsewhere and teaches important skills. They might introduce agriculture, metalworking, navigation, or social laws. In some stories, they stay and become part of the community. In others, they leave as mysteriously as they came. The similarity of these stories across distant cultures is striking. The details differ, but the basic pattern repeats. Someone from outside brings knowledge that changes everything. In the context of an unknown civilization, it's easy to imagine that these myths could be distorted memories of real contact. Perhaps a more advanced group visited multiple places, sharing parts of their knowledge, and those encounters were remembered in the only way available, through story. It's important to note that oral tradition can preserve information with surprising accuracy over long periods. There are examples from Australia where Aboriginal stories describe coastal geography as it was over 7,000 years ago, before sea levels rose. These aren't vague or symbolic, they're specific enough to match modern reconstructions of the ancient landscape. That shows it's possible for a story to carry real, factual content across immense spans of time, even while other parts of it shift or become mythologized. Some myths also include astronomical references, alignments of stars, cycles of the sun and moon, descriptions of eclipses or comets. If those references can be dated, they can provide a time frame for when the story was first told. In some cases, this has allowed researchers to trace a myth back thousands of years, long before the culture that recorded it in writing even existed. Of course, myths aren't perfect records. They're shaped by the needs and values of the people telling them. Elements are added or removed to make a point to entertain, or to fit with current beliefs. Over time, the original event can be buried under layers of symbolism, but that doesn't mean it's gone. It just means you have to work to uncover it. Archaeologists and anthropologists sometimes approach myths like puzzles. They break them down into components, compare them to other stories and look for common threads. If the same unusual detail appears in myths from distant places, it might be a clue that both were influenced by the same historical event. In the search for a forgotten civilization, myths can serve as a kind of map. Not a literal one, but a guide to where to look. If multiple stories from different cultures point to a similar kind of place or event, it might be worth investigating that region for physical evidence. Even if the myth turns out to be only partly true, it can still lead to discoveries. There's also the possibility that some myths were deliberately crafted to preserve knowledge in coded form. If a culture wanted to pass on information but didn't have writing, or feared that writing could be lost, they might embed it in stories and rituals. By tying the knowledge to something memorable and meaningful, they increased the chances it would survive. Whether these myths were conscious attempts to record history, or simply the natural result of oral tradition, their survival is remarkable. They connect us to a chain of memory stretching back far beyond the reach of written records. And within that chain, there may be links forged by people whose names and cultures are gone, but whose experiences still echo in the stories we tell. Some discoveries make sense the moment they're found. They fit into the expected time period, they match the known technology of the culture, and they line up with what we already understand about the past. Then there are the others, the ones that seem to have arrived ahead of schedule, or far from where they should be, or in the hands of people who, according to our current history, shouldn't have had them at all. These are the out-of-place objects, artifacts that challenge the neat timeline we've built for ourselves. They can be small, a metal tool in a layer of earth dated thousands of years earlier than the invention of that type of metalwork, a ceramic shard in a region where that style is supposed to have developed only much later. They can also be large, sections of wall using construction techniques supposedly not invented yet, or carved statues made from materials sourced far beyond the known reach of the local culture. In each case, the initial reaction is often to assume there's been a mistake. And sometimes that's true. Soil layers can be disturbed by natural processes like floods or earthquakes, or by human activity like digging pits for later structures. Objects can be moved, reused, or dropped in places far from where they were originally made. Dating methods can have margins of error, and materials can be misidentified. But even after accounting for those possibilities, there are still examples that remain stubbornly hard to explain. A finely crafted bronze object found in a site that predates the known use of bronze in that region by centuries. A map fragment showing coastlines in accurate detail long before such mapping should have been possible. a piece of advanced-looking gear or mechanism uncovered among otherwise simple tools. One of the best-known cases is a device found off the coast of Greece in the early 20th century, now understood to be a kind of ancient analog computer for predicting astronomical events. It dates to more than 2,000 years ago, and yet its complexity was unmatched for over a millennium afterward. When it was first discovered, many assumed it had to be a recent intrusion into the wreck site, but repeated studies confirmed its age. There are also the controversial examples, objects some claim are millions of years old, embedded in rock or coal, supposedly predating humans entirely. Most of these are dismissed by mainstream archaeology, often with reasonable cause, but the persistence of such claims shows how much fascination there is with the possibility of advanced knowledge existing earlier than we think. In the context of an unknown civilization, out-of-place objects could be the physical remnants of contact. A trader from a more advanced society might have exchanged goods with a smaller, less developed community, leaving behind items that later generations would find puzzling. Or survivors of a collapsed culture might have carried certain prized tools or possessions with them as they merged into other societies. Sometimes these objects appear in isolation, which makes them harder to interpret. A single advanced tool in a site otherwise full of simple stone implements could be an anomaly, a trade good, or even a family heirloom passed down for generations. But when multiple such objects turn up in different places with similar characteristics, the possibility of a shared source becomes harder to ignore. And it's not just tools or weapons. Beads made from materials not found locally, ornaments in styles from distant cultures, and dyes that require plants grown far away all suggest movement and exchange of goods and knowledge. When these appear in places where no known trade route existed, it hints at connections we haven't documented yet. Another angle is the reuse of old objects in new contexts. Imagine a community finding the ruins of an older, more advanced settlement. They might take whatever is useful, stone blocks, metal fragments, worked wood, and adapt them for their own purposes. Over time, the origin of these items would be forgotten, but they'd still exist physically, confusing archaeologists thousands of years later. In some cases, the craftsmanship itself is the puzzle. Certain stone carvings, for instance, show a level of symmetry and smoothness that's difficult to achieve without advanced tools. When similar styles are found in places separated by great distances, it raises questions about whether the knowledge to make them spread through contact or developed independently in both places. It's important to approach these finds carefully. A single extraordinary claim can attract attention for years, even if it's later debunked. But when legitimate archaeologists encounter artifacts that genuinely don't fit, the process is usually slow and cautious. More tests are done, more context is gathered, and alternative explanations are considered before any major conclusions are drawn. Still, every confirmed out-of-place object forces some degree of adjustment in our understanding of history. Sometimes that adjustment is small, a tweak to the known timeline of a technology or trade route. Other times it's larger, suggesting contact between cultures once thought to be isolated. The real challenge is that these objects are rare. If a forgotten civilization did exist, its physical remnants might be scattered thinly across the world, mixed into the layers of other cultures' artifacts. Identifying them requires both luck in discovery and the ability to recognize that something doesn't fit. There's also the possibility that we've already found more of these than we realize, but they've been catalogued under the wrong time period or cultural label. An object might sit in a museum collection for decades before someone notices it doesn't match the others in its category. With advances in dating technology and material analysis, some of these mismatches are now coming to light. In a way, out-of-place objects are like loose threads. Pull on one, and it might lead nowhere, or it might unravel part of the fabric of our accepted history, revealing patterns we hadn't seen before. Each one has the potential to be just an oddity, or to be a clue to something much bigger. When we talk about history, we usually mean written records, physical artifacts, or the ruins of old structures. But there's another record we carry everywhere we go, whether we realise it or not. It's in our bodies, in the cells that make us, in the code that determines everything from the colour of our eyes to how our immune system works. Our DNA is more than a blueprint for the individual. It's a long, continuous record of where we came from, shaped by every generation that came before us. Genetic information is layered like sediment. Some parts are ancient, dating back to the earliest humans. Others are much more recent, the result of interactions and migrations only a few thousand years ago. In between are countless traces of people who lived, travelled, and had families in places that may or may not match the stories told in our history books. Modern genetic research can map these layers, showing where populations mixed and when. Sometimes the results match what we already know from archaeology and history. Sometimes they add new detail, filling in gaps we didn't even realise were there. And sometimes they throw everything into question by revealing connections between groups we thought were isolated from each other. One of the clearest examples is the discovery that all non-African humans today carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA. For years, the dominant theory was that humans and Neanderthals had little to no direct contact beyond occasional competition for territory, but the genetic evidence shows they did meet, and that meeting left a permanent mark in our genes. There are other examples too. Certain populations in Oceania have DNA from another ancient human group called the Denisovans, a group we only discovered through genetic analysis of a single finger bone and a few teeth. That means we learned of an entire branch of the human family tree not from fossils scattered across sites, but from echoes left in the DNA of living people. In the context of an unknown civilization, the question becomes whether genetic evidence might also point to contact with a group that left no clear archaeological footprint. If a small, distinct population existed in a remote area and occasionally mixed with neighbouring cultures, their DNA could survive in modern people even if all other evidence of their existence vanished. This could be especially important for seafaring cultures. If a group was skilled at long-distance navigation, they might have visited faraway lands and had children with the local populations. Over generations, their distinctive genetic markers could spread far beyond their original homeland, even if their settlements didn't survive. Genetic research can also reveal ancient migrations. When DNA from ancient skeletons is compared to that of modern populations, it's sometimes possible to track the movement of people over thousands of years. These movements don't always match the route suggested by archaeology alone, hinting that there may have been other factors, trade, climate change, or contact with unfamiliar cultures, that influenced where people went. There are even cases where genetic evidence suggests the existence of ghost populations. These are groups that must have existed at some point in the past because their DNA is present in living people, but we have no direct record of them. No bones, no artifacts, no written accounts, just a genetic signature that doesn't match any known group. If we think about a possible unknown civilization, ghost populations could be the faintest surviving trace. They might represent a culture that thrived in a region where preservation conditions were poor, leaving nothing behind in the ground. They might have been absorbed into other cultures so completely that all outward signs of their distinct identity disappeared, except in the genetic record. DNA also carries clues about shared traits between populations. Certain adaptations, like the ability to digest milk as an adult, or to thrive at high altitudes, can spread quickly if they offer an advantage. If two distant populations share an unusual adaptation, it can suggest either common ancestry or some kind of past contact. In some cases, the genetic link shows up before archaeology has a chance to explain it. There's a human side to this as well. DNA testing is no longer just for researchers in labs. Millions of people have sent their saliva to commercial testing companies to learn about their ancestry, creating massive genetic databases. While these are mostly used for personal curiosity, they've also been used to identify unexpected connections between populations. Sometimes, They even reveal migration patterns that weren't recorded historically. Geneticists have to be careful when interpreting these results. DNA tells you that two populations share ancestry, but not exactly how that happened. The mixing could have been the result of peaceful trade, migration, forced displacement, or any number of other historical processes. And DNA alone doesn't give dates with perfect precision. Scientists can estimate when two populations last shared common ancestors, but those estimates come with ranges of uncertainty. Still, when the genetic evidence points to a link, it can guide archaeologists toward areas and time periods worth investigating more closely. In some ways, DNA is the most democratic record of the past we have. It's carried by everyone, not just the wealthy or powerful who could afford to commission monuments or record their deeds in writing. It contains the history of people who left no physical traces, who might never appear in any written history, but whose descendants are alive today. If there was an advanced or far-reaching civilization that's now lost to us, it's possible that its only surviving legacy is in our genes. Maybe they were traders, explorers, or migrants who mixed with other groups across vast distances. Maybe they left behind children who grew up in entirely different cultures, carrying with them the genetic echoes of their ancestors. This isn't proof by itself. A shared genetic marker doesn't automatically mean there was an unknown civilization. It just means there was contact between groups. But in combination with other clues, anomalies in artifacts, unexpected alignments in monuments, similarities in myths, it can help build a case that something more complex was happening in the distant past than we've recognized. And as genetic research advances, we may find more of these ghostly fingerprints in our DNA. Each one is a reminder that even if a civilization leaves no stone buildings, no written language, and no tools behind, it can still leave a trace in the people who came after. Sometimes you come across a structure that just stops you in your tracks. Not because it's beautiful, though many of them are, and not even because it's old, though that's often the case. It's because it doesn't seem to belong where or when it is. The technology, the precision, the sheer ambition of it feels out of step with the rest of the surrounding culture. It's as if someone dropped a piece of another world into the timeline, and no one can quite agree on how it got there. We're used to thinking of architectural progress as a steady climb. Simple shelters become huts, huts become houses, houses become fortresses, temples, palaces. But in reality, it's not always so neat. There are sudden jumps, bursts of innovation that appear without clear predecessors, then disappear again just as quickly. Sometimes those jumps happen in isolation, with no obvious influence from outside. Other times they seem to draw on knowledge that shouldn't be present yet. One example is in the use of massive stone blocks, cut and placed with such precision that the seams are almost invisible. In some sites, these blocks weigh dozens or even hundreds of tons, and yet they are arranged in patterns that suggest not only advanced engineering but also an understanding of seismic stability. Design choices that keep the structure standing through centuries of earthquakes. In other places, we find corbelled arches, intricate vaulting, or surprisingly sophisticated drainage systems appearing in cultures that, according to the accepted timeline, shouldn't have had the knowledge or tools to build them. The usual explanation is that the techniques were borrowed from neighbouring cultures, but in some cases, there's no evidence of those neighbours having the skills either. There are also examples where the oldest parts of a structure are the most advanced. Temples built on foundations that are far more precise than the buildings above them. Walls whose lower layers are expertly fitted stone, with upper sections that are rougher, less stable, and clearly from a later period. That's the reverse of what you'd expect if technology was advancing in a straightforward line. Then there's the issue of materials. Some ancient builders use stone types that are incredibly difficult to work with, even with modern tools. Harder stones like granite and basalt require sustained effort to shape and polish, yet in certain sites, they're used extensively in ways that suggest both an aesthetic preference and a technical mastery of the material. At a few locations, those stones are quarried from sources many kilometres away, sometimes across rivers or up steep terrain. Moving them would have required either immense manpower, ingenious engineering, or both. And yet no clear record of the method survives. Architecture that seems out of place can also show up in small details. Perfectly round holes drilled into stone, far deeper and more uniform than could be achieved with the tools we know were available at the time. Patterns in masonry that are mathematically precise, suggesting an understanding of geometry that exceeds what we've attributed to that culture. In some cases, the layout of entire cities shows a level of planning that feels ahead of its time. Grid systems, water distribution networks, even systems for managing waste. These are hallmarks of urban design that we don't always see until much later in other parts of the world. When they appear early, they raise questions about where the knowledge came from. One possibility is that these bursts of advancement are the result of lost exchanges between cultures. A travelling group might have brought ideas from a distant region, and those ideas were briefly implemented before fading away. Another is that the knowledge was inherited from a previous, more advanced local culture whose identity has since disappeared. There are also examples where the architectural style seems to have no local precedent at all. It appears fully formed in its mature state, without any experimental or transitional versions in the archaeological record. That's unusual, because most building techniques evolve gradually over time. When you see something perfected from the start, it suggests the builders already knew exactly what they were doing. We can also look at alignments and orientations. Some structures are positioned with incredible accuracy to cardinal directions, solstices, equinoxes, or specific stars. While this isn't impossible without modern tools, it requires a combination of careful observation, mathematical skill, and architectural execution. In certain cases, the precision is so high that it challenges the assumption that the builders had no instruments more sophisticated than basic sighting tools. Of course, not every unusual feature means there was an unknown civilization involved. Sometimes it's simply a case of underestimating the ingenuity of ancient builders. But in other cases, the anomalies pile up. You find a combination of advanced techniques, unusual materials, and inexplicable precision all in one site, with no clear cultural or historical pathway to explain them. There's also the question of why some techniques vanish. If a culture develops a highly effective building method, you'd expect it to be used consistently afterward. Yet in some regions, we see the opposite. Methods appear in one generation and are abandoned in the next, replaced by less durable or less sophisticated approaches. That suggests either a loss of knowledge or a change in priorities, both of which could happen if the original builders were replaced or absorbed by a different group. When you start comparing these anomalies across regions, patterns sometimes emerge. Similar masonry styles appear in places separated by oceans. Similar city layouts show up in areas that, according to our records, had no contact. While independent invention is always a possibility, repeated coincidences in complex techniques begin to stretch that explanation. If there was an unknown civilization with advanced architectural knowledge, its fingerprints might still be visible. Not in complete structures, but in the foundations, in the oldest and most puzzling parts of buildings we think we already understand. And yet, architecture is vulnerable. Wars destroy, earthquakes crumble, weather erodes, wood rots, bricks dissolve, plaster flakes away, even stone eventually wears down. What we see today is a fraction of what was once built, and the most impressive parts might have been lost long ago. Still, the pieces that remain are enough to raise questions. They're enough to suggest that somewhere in the deep past, there may have been people building things they shouldn't have been able to build in ways we can't fully explain. Tools are one of the clearest markers of technological progress. We chart history partly by the materials and methods used to make them: stone, bronze, iron, steel. Each step forward opens up new possibilities, and the old tools often fade away, replaced by better ones. But every so often we come across a tool or device that doesn't fit the expected progression. It's not just old, it's different, sometimes better in ways we can't easily reproduce. These are the tools we forgot how to make. Sometimes these are literal tools, chisels, drills, or cutting implements made from materials or using techniques that seem out of place for their time. Other times, they're more complex devices like measuring instruments, mechanical systems, or even chemical processes, all of which require a chain of knowledge to create and use effectively. When we find them, they raise two immediate questions. Who made them, and why did the knowledge to make them disappear? In some cases, the disappearance makes sense. A technique might have been tied to a particular resource that ran out or became inaccessible. If a special kind of stone or metal was available only in one area, and that area was abandoned, the method for working with it might be lost as well. Other times, a more efficient method could replace an older one so completely that the old knowledge simply wasn't passed on. But in other cases, it's harder to explain. We find objects that show a level of craftsmanship requiring not just skill, but the right combination of tools and processes, and yet no surviving culture in that region is known to have had them. Take, for example, ancient stonework that shows drill holes with spiral grooves, suggesting a rotary drilling method capable of removing material quickly and evenly. Recreating that today requires high-quality drill bits and steady rotational power. But in the period these stones are dated to, the known tools wouldn't produce those marks, not at that speed, not with that precision. Or consider metallurgy. There are artifacts from certain periods that show metal purity or alloy compositions beyond what's believed possible for the technology of the time. Some ancient steel, for instance, was so well made that it resisted corrosion for centuries in harsh environments. In some cases, modern metallurgists have only recently figured out how to replicate it, and sometimes only with difficulty. There are also examples in textiles. Certain ancient fabrics show weaving patterns so fine and consistent that even with modern machinery, they're challenging to reproduce at scale. They may use natural dyes with colours that remain vibrant thousands of years later, the formulas for which are still unknown. And then there are chemical tools. Compounds used for preservation, waterproofing, or strengthening materials have been found on ancient objects, but the exact recipes and methods for making them are lost. Sometimes analysis reveals ingredients we don't expect to find in that time or place, meaning the makers either had trade connections to far-off regions or access to resources that have since vanished. What's striking about some of these lost tools is that they don't always seem to have been part of a gradual build-up of knowledge. Instead, they appear fully developed, as if the makers already had a deep understanding of how to create them. Then, for reasons unknown, the knowledge was no longer passed down. This pattern mirrors what we see in some architecture, bursts of advanced capability that aren't connected to the earlier or later skill levels in the same region. If a culture inherited tools or techniques from an outside source, it could explain how they appeared suddenly and disappeared just as quickly. There's also the possibility that some tools were highly specialized, made for specific purposes we no longer recognize. Without understanding their intended use, we might overlook their sophistication or misinterpret their design. An unusual blade shape might look ornamental to us, but could have been perfectly suited for a particular craft or material. A set of markings on a device might seem decorative, but could have been functional measurements. The loss of tools isn't always due to neglect or lack of interest. Political collapse, war, natural disasters, all can wipe out not just people, but the infrastructure needed to create certain tools. If making a particular instrument required multiple specialists, each with their own skill set, losing even one link in that chain could end the process entirely. Oral tradition can help preserve some of this knowledge, but without regular use, the details fade. And with no written record, a tool that was once common could become a mystery in just a few generations. In some cases, rediscovery happens by accident. Archaeologists studying ancient pottery might find microscopic traces of an unusual glaze component, leading chemists to test ways of reproducing it. Historians poring over old manuscripts might find detailed illustrations of devices that no longer exist, prompting experimental reconstructions. Sometimes these experiments succeed, showing that the past was capable of more than we assumed. In the context of an unknown civilization, tools we forgot how to make could be the strongest form of physical evidence they left behind. Unlike myths or alignments, which can be interpreted in many ways, a physical object with measurable properties is harder to dismiss. If we find an advanced tool in a context where it doesn't belong and can't explain how it was made with the known technology of the time, it forces a reconsideration of the timeline. The challenge is proving the connection. One isolated find might be explained away as an imported good or a lucky accident of craftsmanship. But if similar tools show up in multiple, unconnected sites, the case grows stronger for a shared source. And just like with architecture, sometimes the most advanced examples are the oldest. That doesn't fit the model of steady technological progress, but it does fit the idea of knowledge being passed down from a group that was already highly skilled and then slowly diluted or lost. When we think about the tools we've lost, it's easy to imagine what else might be missing. Entire categories of devices and techniques that never survived long enough for us to find. Every now and then, a discovery reminds us that history isn't just about what we've learned, but also about what we've forgotten. The ocean is the largest archive in the world, but it's one we can barely read. It covers more than 70% of the planet, and much of it is still unexplored. Beneath its surface lie mountain ranges taller than the Himalayas, valleys deeper than the Grand Canyon, and an untold number of places that no human eyes have seen. It's a vast, shifting library where the records are buried under layers of silt and guarded by pressure, darkness, and cold. What makes the ocean such a silent witness to history is that it preserves and hides at the same time. In some places, the cold temperatures and lack of oxygen slow decay to a crawl, keeping shipwrecks and submerged structures intact for centuries or even millennia. In others, currents and storms erase all traces within years. The ocean decides what survives and what vanishes, and it doesn't keep its decisions consistent. If there was ever an unknown civilization, especially one with access to the coast, the ocean may have taken much of it. At the end of the last ice age, when massive ice sheets melted and sea levels rose by more than 100 meters, countless coastal settlements would have been swallowed. Entire regions that once lay on dry land are now hundreds of meters underwater. Coastal cities make sense for early civilizations. They offer food from both land and sea, access to trade routes, and defensible positions. But when the seas rose, many of those cities would have been lost without a trace on land. All their buildings, harbours and artefacts would now lie under layers of sediment on the seafloor. Modern sonar and remote-operated vehicles have revealed some hints of what's down there. Stone formations that look suspiciously like walls, patterns that resemble streets, shapes that might be the remains of docks or breakwaters. In a few cases, divers have brought back worked stone blocks from depths where no natural formation matches them. But searching the ocean is slow, expensive, and technically challenging. Mapping the seafloor in detail is still in its early stages, and most of the world's oceans have never been surveyed at the resolution needed to spot smaller structures. In some areas, visibility is so poor that even if you're a few meters away from something, you might not see it. Then there's the difficulty of proving what you've found. Natural processes can create shapes that look artificial, and erosion can distort genuine structures until they're almost unrecognizable. Without clear artifacts, tools, pottery, inscriptions, it's hard to convince the wider world that an underwater feature is the work of human hands. Still, the ocean has given up some of its secrets. Ancient shipwrecks, preserved almost perfectly, have been found with cargoes that tell us about trade routes stretching farther than we realised. Harbours and seawalls dating back thousands of years have been discovered beneath modern shorelines, showing that people were shaping the coast long before written history began. There are also submerged landscapes, river valleys, forests and plains that were once dry land. In some cases, they show evidence of human activity before the flooding. Stone tools have been found in riverbeds now far below the surface, and traces of hearths have been identified under layers of marine sediment. If we imagine a civilization skilled in navigation and seafaring, it's easy to see how much of their world could now be lost to us. Their coastal hubs, shipyards and trading ports would all be underwater. Even inland structures near estuaries could have been drowned. Their ships might have travelled widely, but without their home bases intact, the scale of their reach would be harder to detect. The ocean also preserves things in unexpected ways. In the Black Sea, for example, the lack of oxygen at certain depths has kept wooden structures from rotting for thousands of years. In cold northern waters, entire ships have been found, with their masts still standing, their ropes intact. If we find one such site linked to a culture we can't identify, it could change our understanding of how far back complex seafaring really goes. But the ocean doesn't just hold physical remains, it holds patterns. Currents, migration routes of fish, and seasonal winds can all leave indirect evidence of human use. Ancient mariners would have learned to work with these patterns, and in some regions, you can trace where people might have travelled based on the distribution of certain goods or even plant species that don't belong naturally in the area. Some researchers have suggested that certain myths about lands beneath the sea could be memories of these drowned coastlines. If people watched their homes disappear under the water, that event would be remembered for generations, passed down in story form long after the details were blurred. In modern times, technology is making it easier to explore these submerged worlds. Autonomous underwater vehicles can map the seafloor in high resolution, and advances in underwater imaging can penetrate murky water to reveal shapes beneath. Each new survey has the potential to reveal something that changes what we think we know about human history. But for every discovery made, there are thousands of possible sites still hidden. If an unknown civilization did exist, especially one that thrived along coastlines, the majority of its remains could be in places we haven't even looked yet. And so, the ocean remains a keeper of secrets, holding on to the evidence of lives, journeys and cultures that may have existed entirely beyond the reach of our current knowledge. The night sky is the one thing that hasn't changed much in all of human history. The continents have shifted, rivers have changed course, cities have risen and fallen, but the stars have always been there. They move in patterns so steady that people thousands of years ago could track them without telescopes, using nothing more than careful observation and memory. For early cultures, the sky wasn't just a backdrop. It was a clock, a compass, and a calendar all at once. Many ancient sites around the world show signs of astronomical alignment. Structures are positioned so that the sun rises or sets at a particular point on the horizon during the solstice. Stones are arranged to mark lunar cycles. Some buildings even have small openings or corridors designed to let in sunlight at a specific time of year, casting light on a certain carving or chamber. These features weren't accidental. They required years of observation and planning. For most known ancient cultures, such alignments were tied to agriculture and religion. Knowing exactly when the seasons would change was vital for planting and harvesting crops. The sky also played a role in rituals, marking times for festivals or ceremonies. But in some cases, the level of precision goes beyond what you'd expect for those purposes alone. Some sites align not only to the sun and moon, but also to specific stars or constellations. This kind of alignment requires tracking those stars over long periods, because they shift slowly over centuries due to the precession of the Earth's axis. Finding a building aligned to a star as it appeared thousands of years ago suggests the builders had knowledge spanning generations, or that they inherited it from someone who did. If we consider the possibility of an unknown civilization, the sky could have been one of their main tools for navigating both time and space. A seafaring culture would need to know how to find its way across open water without landmarks, and the stars would have been the most reliable guide. Once you know the patterns, you can estimate your position and direction with surprising accuracy. There's also evidence that some ancient people tracked planetary movements. This is harder than following the sun or moon, because planets don't follow the same simple path. They move against the background of stars, sometimes appearing to reverse direction in the sky. Predicting those movements takes careful record keeping over many years. In some traditions, the sky was more than a practical tool. It was a way to encode and pass down knowledge. Constellations could act as memory aids, with each star or group of stars linked to a story that contained information about navigation, seasonal changes, or even historical events. These stories could be shared across generations, preserving knowledge without writing. What's interesting is that similar star-based systems appear in widely separated parts of the world. Different cultures identify different shapes in the stars, but the underlying use of the sky as a long-term record is a recurring theme. If an unknown civilization influenced multiple regions, its methods could have spread along with its other skills. Some ancient calendars were astonishingly accurate. The Maya, for example, tracked solar years with almost no error for centuries. They also kept multiple overlapping calendars, one for the solar year, one for a ritual cycle, and others for longer periods. Creating such a system requires not just observation, but also complex mathematics. If a forgotten culture was skilled in astronomy, we might see traces of that skill in places we wouldn't expect. For example, structures aligned to both local seasonal events and distant celestial markers could suggest influence from a group with wider knowledge. Unusual similarities in star lore between distant cultures might also be a clue. There are challenges to interpreting these alignments. Erosion, rebuilding, and even ground movement over time can shift the positions of structures, making it hard to confirm their original orientation. Sometimes what looks like a deliberate alignment is just a coincidence. But when multiple features in a site point to the same astronomical target, it becomes harder to dismiss. Astronomy also leaves patterns in art and artifacts. Carvings of specific star patterns, symbols representing planetary cycles, and depictions of eclipses can all be matched to known celestial events. If a depiction matches an event from thousands of years before the artifact was made, it could mean the information was passed down over long periods. In some cases, the accuracy of these depictions suggests direct observation rather than guesswork. A carving of a solar eclipse, for example, can be matched to the exact date and location where it would have been visible. If that date is far earlier than the known history of the culture that made the carving, it raises questions about where the knowledge came from. Another intriguing angle is how the sky can be used for long-distance coordination. If two groups far apart both track the same celestial events, they can synchronize their activities without direct communication. A shared calendar based on the stars could allow for coordinated trade or migration patterns over large areas. And unlike other forms of record keeping, the sky is always available. It doesn't decay like parchment, rot like wood, or erode like stone carvings. The patterns change slowly enough that a skilled observer today could reconstruct much of what an ancient astronomer saw, making it one of the few constants we share across all of human history. For an unknown civilization, the sky could have been both a practical tool and a cultural unifier, a way to organize time, navigate the world, and pass down knowledge across generations and distances. Trade is one of the oldest human activities. Long before coins or writing, people were exchanging goods: stone for shells, grain for meat, pigments for tools. It didn't take long for trade to become more than just a way to get necessities. It became a way to connect different groups, to exchange not just products but also ideas, stories, and techniques. Most ancient trade routes that we know about were practical. They followed rivers, hugged coastlines, or crossed stretches of land where water and shelter were available. Archaeologists can often trace them by looking for the spread of certain materials. Obsidian from one mountain range shows up in tools hundreds of kilometers away. Shells from a distant coast are found in inland graves. But sometimes the distribution of goods doesn't make sense based on the routes we think existed. Artifacts turn up thousands of kilometers from their source, with no known intermediate cultures to bridge the gap. Certain materials appear in places they shouldn't, long before those regions are believed to have had the technology or connections to get them. This is where the idea of trade routes beyond time comes in. The possibility that some ancient networks of exchange were older, wider, and more complex than our current history recognises. One example is the appearance of particular gemstones in regions far from their sources at dates much earlier than established trade routes suggest. If the artefacts are genuine and the dating is accurate, it means either the materials travelled through many hands over long periods, or someone made the journey directly, long before such travel was thought possible. There are also cases where unusual food crops appear far from their native regions, long before recorded contact. This suggests that seeds or plants were carried deliberately and cultivated in new environments. Doing this successfully requires not just transportation, but also knowledge of how to grow and use the plants. In some parts of the world, the distribution of certain metallurgical techniques hints at connections between cultures that should have been isolated from each other. When you find identical methods for smelting or alloying in places separated by oceans, you have to ask how that knowledge moved. If we consider the possibility of an unknown civilization, these patterns start to make more sense. A maritime culture with advanced navigation could have connected distant lands, carrying goods and ideas across vast distances. If their presence was temporary, or if they left few permanent settlements, they might not have left an obvious archaeological trail, just the goods and ideas that others adopted. This could also explain sudden bursts of innovation in certain regions. A group might have received not just a new material, but also the knowledge of how to use it. That knowledge could then spread quickly, even if the original source vanished from the record. There's an important distinction between trade as we usually imagine it, ongoing, structured exchange between known groups, and what might have happened here. If the routes were managed by a civilization we've lost, they might not have been permanent. They could have been active for a few centuries, then disrupted by environmental change, conflict, or the collapse of the civilization itself. Archaeological evidence for such routes is subtle. You might find only a handful of objects from a distant source in any given site. Over a wide enough area, though, those finds can form a pattern. The challenge is recognizing that pattern when the individual pieces are scattered across museums and private collections, often with incomplete records of where they were found. In some cases, myths and oral histories hint at these ancient connections. Stories of strangers arriving by sea, bringing unusual goods, or speaking unfamiliar languages might be echoes of real contact. When these stories appear in multiple cultures separated by large distances, they add weight to the idea of a shared point of origin. There's also the possibility of overland routes far older than we realise. Shifting climates and changing landscapes can erase the traces of ancient paths. Deserts expand, forests grow over clearings, rivers change course. A route that once linked two regions directly could disappear completely from the visible landscape within a few generations. Modern technology is helping to rediscover some of these routes. Satellite imagery can reveal faint traces of ancient roads, while chemical analysis of artifacts can pinpoint their place of origin with surprising precision. When goods from the same source are found along a line stretching across vast distances, it can indicate a route that may have been in use long before we thought such networks existed. For a long-lost civilization, trade could have been both a lifeline and a legacy. By connecting distant parts of the world, they could have spread not just goods, but also culture, technology, and ideas. Even after their own disappearance, the echoes of their roots might persist in the distribution of materials and knowledge. The difficulty is that trade routes rarely leave solid remains. You can find traces of buildings, ships, or tools, but a route is just a path. Without constant use, it fades quickly, leaving only the goods as evidence. And goods can be moved again and again, blurring the trail until it's almost impossible to follow. But sometimes, the goods speak clearly enough. When a material turns up repeatedly in places where it shouldn't be, when techniques match across distant regions, and when myths hint at contact, you start to see the outline of something larger. And it's in those outlines that we might find the faint shape of a network that belonged to someone we've forgotten. Plants travel with people, sometimes by design, sometimes by accident. Seeds cling to clothing, hide in bundles of traded goods, or get carried in the stomachs of animals brought along for food. When people move, whether across a valley or an ocean, the plants they value often go with them. Over time, this leaves a botanical trail, a map not made of stone or ink, but of roots, stems, and fruit. Archaeologists and botanists use these trails to track human movement. A crop's presence far from its native range suggests it was deliberately introduced. In some cases, we can see when a plant first appears in the archaeological record of a new region. Sometimes this matches known migration or trade patterns, but other times the dates don't line up. The plant shows up earlier than it should, in a place it shouldn't be, without a clear path explaining how it got there. These are the botanical equivalents of out-of-place artifacts. They may not look as impressive as a finely crafted tool or an advanced piece of architecture, but they can be just as revealing. The unexpected spread of certain plants hints at connections that aren't recorded anywhere else. Take maize, for example. Native to the Americas, it was a staple crop for centuries before European contact. Yet there are claims, though still debated, of maize residues in ancient sites in regions where no transoceanic contact was thought to have happened. If verified, that would imply some form of exchange across vast distances earlier than we believe possible. Other plants tell quieter stories. Cotton varieties in widely separated parts of the world share traits that suggest a shared ancestry, even when the regions don't appear to have had contact in known history. Sweet potatoes, native to South America, have been found in pre-contact Polynesia, suggesting either deliberate or accidental transport across the Pacific, long before European ships made those journeys. Sometimes the spread isn't about the plant itself, but the knowledge of how to cultivate it. Certain crops require careful planting schedules, soil preparation, or processing before they're edible. If a culture with no prior experience of that plant starts growing it successfully, it likely means someone showed them how. For a forgotten civilization, seeds could have been one of their most enduring gifts, or traces. A seafaring group could carry plant varieties from one side of the world to another, intentionally introducing them to new environments. If their settlements didn't survive, the plants might be the only sign they were ever there. Botanical evidence can also suggest ancient climate conditions. If a plant is found in an archaeological layer from a time when the local climate wouldn't have supported it, that can indicate trade from another region, or environmental shifts we haven't accounted for. Both possibilities can reshape our understanding of how and where people lived. The challenge with plants is that they decay quickly. Seeds, pollen, and plant fibers don't survive as well as stone or metal. But under the right conditions, dry caves, frozen ground, waterlogged soils, they can last for thousands of years. And even when the plants themselves are gone, they can leave chemical traces in soil, pottery, or dental remains. Genetic analysis has added another layer to this research. By studying the DNA of modern and ancient plant varieties, scientists can reconstruct their evolutionary and migration histories. When a plant's genetic trail takes an unexpected turn, appearing suddenly in a distant place without intermediate steps, it's a clue that people were moving it across distances much earlier than expected. Sometimes these genetic patterns show that a plant in one region is more closely related to a distant variety than to its neighbours. That suggests direct contact, not a slow, step-by-step spread. Plants also carry cultural meaning. Certain crops are tied to rituals, ceremonies, or trade value beyond their practical use. If a plant shows up in an archaeological context tied to prestige or status, it might indicate the arrival of new ideas along with the crop itself. And then there's the possibility of plants disappearing. Just as tools can be forgotten, crops can be lost. A variety that once grew in abundance might vanish from a region entirely, leaving only faint genetic traces in modern relatives. If an unknown civilization introduced such a plant, and the culture that relied on it collapsed, it could vanish without a trace beyond the soil where it once grew. Botanical clues are often overlooked because they don't grab attention the way monumental ruins or gold artifacts do. But in some ways, they're more telling. A seed doesn't move itself. It arrives where it does because someone, directly or indirectly, brought it there. Each time we find one in a place it shouldn't be, we're seeing the shadow of a journey, a connection, or a relationship that history hasn't recorded. If a civilization operated quietly, without leaving towering stone monuments or vast cities, the plants they moved might be the most visible legacy they left. A seed can survive longer than memory, sprouting generation after generation, carrying with it the story of the hands that first planted it in unfamiliar soil. When we look at the rise of known civilizations, we often focus on what they achieved in their own right. The monumental buildings, the written records, the systems of government, the art, the technologies. Each one is treated as a product of that culture's ingenuity, shaped by its environment, resources, and historical circumstances. But what if those civilizations were not entirely self-contained? What if their development was nudged, guided, or even accelerated by contact with a group we no longer remember? In most timelines, early states seem to emerge independently in different regions: Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, the Americas. Each develops agriculture, urban centres, and systems of administration. The differences in architecture, writing systems, and cultural practices suggest they grew out of their own unique contexts. But there are similarities that stand out. The rapid shift from simple villages to complex cities, the sudden appearance of large-scale construction projects, the early mastery of certain technologies, and the speed with which some of these advancements spread. If you imagine a civilization already in possession of advanced knowledge, whether in agriculture, metallurgy, navigation, or governance, making contact with less complex societies, it's easy to see how they could leave a lasting imprint. They wouldn't need to conquer or replace the locals. Passing on ideas and techniques could be enough to change the course of development. Sometimes, the earliest phases of a known civilization are the most puzzling. In Mesopotamia, for example, the first cities appear with sophisticated irrigation systems and administrative tools already in place. In Egypt, monumental stone architecture arrives early in the Old Kingdom, with techniques that seem perfected from the start. In the Andes, large ceremonial centres appear before widespread agriculture in some regions. These leaps could be explained by internal innovation, but they could also fit the pattern of influence from an external source. Contact doesn't have to mean direct teaching. Trade can spread not just goods, but the knowledge of how to use them. Exposure to new materials or ideas can spark local adaptations that lead to entirely new developments. A single encounter might inspire changes that ripple outward for generations. The problem is that influence is hard to prove in the archaeological record. Cultural traits can develop independently in response to similar needs. Two societies facing the same environmental challenges might arrive at similar solutions without ever meeting. But when multiple elements, technologies, architectural forms, symbolic systems, appear together in distant places, the possibility of a shared influence becomes harder to dismiss. Genetic evidence might also hint at such connections. If populations in early urban centres show signs of admixture from distant groups, it could point to migrations or visitors who brought new skills along with them. But again, proving the source of those skills is difficult. Oral traditions sometimes preserve hints of these encounters. Stories of strangers arriving with unusual tools, bringing knowledge of farming or building, or teaching new ways to track time are found in many cultures. Often, these visitors are described in mythic terms as culture heroes or deities. Over time, the details blur, and the original humans behind the stories become larger than life. If an unknown civilization influenced the rise of others, their contributions might be hiding in plain sight. The agricultural staples that underpin an empire, the layout of a city, the techniques for working stone or metal, these could all be borrowed without the borrower even knowing their true origin. Once integrated into daily life, They become local knowledge, indistinguishable from homegrown innovations. The disappearance of the original source could happen quickly. If they were a mobile or coastal people, environmental change could erase their settlements. If they were few in number compared to the populations they influence, their identity could dissolve within a few generations of mixing. Their legacy would live on in the achievements of others, but their name and story would vanish. This raises another question. If they shape the civilizations we know, how much of what we consider independent achievement is actually inherited? If ideas, techniques, and even social structures were seeded from outside, then the early stages of our history might be a tapestry woven from threads that came from far beyond the areas we've studied in depth. Some researchers point to the clustering of early monumental architecture around similar latitudes as a possible sign of coordinated knowledge. Others note the way certain mathematical systems, mythological motifs, and symbolic patterns show up across continents. While these patterns could be coincidence or the result of convergent development, they could also be the residue of a widespread but now invisible network of influence. The concept of a guiding or contributing civilization doesn't diminish the achievements of the cultures we know. If anything, it highlights their adaptability, their ability to take new tools and ideas and make them their own. Influence is not the same as dependence. Even with outside input, the way a culture integrates and develops that input is shaped by its own needs, values, and creativity. What's more, the same influence could play out very differently in different places. One society might use a new tool for building irrigation systems, another for fortifications. One might adapt a navigation method for river travel, another for crossing seas. The source is the same, but the outcomes vary. If this idea is correct, then parts of our shared heritage may be far older than we realize, passed from hand to hand until they reach the civilizations that recorded them. The original bearers may be gone, but the traces of their knowledge still shape our world. When we talk about civilizations that no longer exist, we usually have some idea of what happened to them. Wars, invasions, droughts, economic collapse, shifting trade routes, epidemics. In many cases, the evidence is clear enough to reconstruct the chain of events, even if some details remain uncertain. But with an unknown civilization, one not recorded in history and visible only through indirect traces, the question becomes much harder. Why did they vanish, and how did they leave so little behind? If we imagine a group advanced enough to influence others, they must have been organized, resourceful, and adaptable. Those qualities make sudden disappearance less likely unless something overwhelming occurred. One possibility is environmental change. The end of the last ice age reshaped coastlines, flooded vast areas of land, and altered climates around the globe. If this civilization was heavily coastal, rising seas could have swallowed many of its settlements. Such flooding wouldn't necessarily destroy all life in those communities. Survivors could move inland, but they might lose access to the resources and trade networks that sustained their way of life. Over generations, they could merge with inland populations, their distinct culture fading until only fragments remained. Another possibility is a catastrophic natural disaster. Large volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, or massive earthquakes can erase entire regions in a short time. We have records of eruptions like Tambora in 1815 causing global temperature drops and widespread crop failures. If something similar, or larger, happened thousands of years earlier, it could have pushed even a well-established culture to the brink. Disease is another factor. A new pathogen, introduced through contact with distant populations, could spread quickly, especially among communities connected by trade. Without immunity or effective treatment, the effects could be devastating. Such an event might not only reduce population numbers drastically, but also disrupt the systems needed to maintain infrastructure and pass on knowledge. Conflict is harder to assess without records, but it remains a common cause of collapse. Competition for resources, territorial expansion, or cultural differences can lead to sustained wars. If the unknown civilization was small in number, but technologically advanced, it might still have been vulnerable to larger, less advanced groups, overwhelming them through persistence and numbers. Internal decline is also a possibility. Technological skill doesn't guarantee social stability. Leadership struggles, economic inequality, or loss of public trust can weaken even the most capable societies from within. In such cases, collapse might not come from a single dramatic event, but from a slow erosion of cohesion and purpose. There's also the chance that they didn't truly vanish in the sense of disappearing completely. Instead, they may have been absorbed into the cultures they once influenced. Over time, their identity could dissolve into the larger population, leaving only subtle differences in language, tradition, or technology as evidence they were ever distinct. Archaeological gaps can make a disappearance seem more complete than it really was. If most of their settlements were built from materials that decay quickly, or located in areas prone to erosion, there might be nothing left for us to find. Wood rots, metal corrodes, textiles disintegrate. Even stone can weather away in the right conditions. Without monumental stone architecture or durable inscriptions, a culture can disappear almost entirely from the physical record. Political erasure is another possibility. If they came into conflict with another group that then dominated the region, the victors might have intentionally destroyed records and symbols of the defeated culture. This has happened throughout history, where conquerors rewrite history to emphasize their own achievements and minimize or erase their rivals. If the unknown civilization operated across a wide area, but with relatively small, scattered settlements, their disappearance might not have been sudden or dramatic. It could have been a gradual fading, with each community facing its own challenges until none of them retained the identity of the whole. The most difficult scenario to recognize is one where they voluntarily abandoned their way of life, if environmental changes or other pressures made their old systems impractical. They might have shifted to a simpler mode of living, scattering into smaller groups that blended into their surroundings. In that case, their disappearance wouldn't be a collapse so much as a transformation. What makes the question of their vanishing so intriguing is that if they did influence known civilizations, then part of them still exists. Their ideas, methods, and even their genetic legacy could be woven into the cultures that followed. Their name may be gone, their monuments lost, but their impact might be embedded in the very foundations of later societies. The disappearance of such a group wouldn't mean their story truly ended. It would just mean we're reading the later chapters without knowing the prologue. When we speak of civilizations that have vanished, it's natural to picture them as entirely gone, their people scattered or absorbed, their culture dissolved into the background of history. But disappearance in the historical sense doesn't always mean physical extinction. A group can stop being recognized as a distinct civilization while still existing in some form. That possibility raises a different kind of question. Could the unknown civilization we've been considering still be here, hidden in plain sight? If they were coastal or island-based, survivors of whatever ended their prominence could have retreated to remote areas, intentionally avoiding large-scale contact with the wider world. Isolation isn't an impossible choice. Even in the modern era, there are communities that live apart from the mainstream, maintaining traditions and languages that differ sharply from those of surrounding nations. Some of these communities are known to outsiders but remain culturally separate by preference. Over centuries, such a group could adapt to changing circumstances while preserving core elements of their heritage. To an outsider, they might appear as just another small cultural group, but within their own community, oral history and practice could keep alive memories of a time when they were far more influential. If their knowledge base was practical rather than monumental, focused on navigation, agriculture, or certain crafts, it would be easier for them to adapt without leaving obvious physical traces. Skills can be applied in new settings without drawing attention. A method for reading the stars or selecting the best seeds doesn't need to be tied to massive structures or inscriptions to survive. There's also the possibility of partial survival through integration. Instead of maintaining strict isolation, they might have merged with other societies, retaining only fragments of their language, beliefs, or techniques. Over time, those fragments could blend so completely that they appear as local traditions with no obvious connection to anything larger. But for those with the right knowledge, subtle clues might still be visible. Certain architectural details, recurring motifs in art, unusual agricultural practices, or navigation methods that don't match surrounding cultures could all hint at a deeper origin. Oral history could be a key here. Many cultures preserve stories of origin that place their ancestors somewhere far away, or describe a migration from a land that no longer exists. While such stories are often interpreted symbolically, some could be grounded in real events. If a community preserves unusually specific knowledge about distant places, seasonal patterns, or astronomical cycles that might be a sign of inherited memory, if an unknown civilization did persist in some form, it might also explain certain historical puzzles, instances where techniques or ideas appear suddenly in a region without clear local precursors. A small surviving group could act as quiet transmitters of knowledge, passing on just enough to spark new developments without revealing the full scope of their past. The difficulty in identifying such a group today is compounded by time. Over thousands of years, languages shift, customs evolve, and even core identity markers can change. Without written records or a strong reason to preserve a specific narrative, details fade. A people might know they are distinct from their neighbours but have no clear memory of why or how. Modern anthropology and genetics offer some tools for detection. Unusual genetic markers in a population that otherwise matches its neighbours could suggest an older, separate origin. Distinct linguistic structures or vocabulary with no clear local roots can also hint at long-term survival from a different source. But even with these tools, the evidence might be ambiguous, and interpretation depends on context. There's also the question of whether such a group would want to be found. History is full of examples where contact with larger, more technologically advanced societies has brought disruption or destruction. For a people who have survived by remaining unnoticed, revealing themselves could feel like a risk. Their choice to remain unseen could be deliberate, a strategy learned from past encounters. Another angle is the idea of legacy without continuity. Perhaps no direct descendants remain, but certain enclaves or traditions still carry forward elements of their worldview. This could be as simple as a navigation method embedded in the training of certain seafarers, or a particular way of mapping the stars that survives in scattered coastal communities. In such cases, the civilization is gone, but parts of it are still active, woven into other cultures without attribution. There's also the possibility that remnants of this civilization have survived in forms we wouldn't recognize as such. The modern world contains communities whose ways of life are adapted to very specific environments, mountains, deserts, rainforests, in ways that suggest deep historical continuity. Some of these adaptations may have origins in knowledge systems far older than the currently recognized timeline for those areas. The survival of a civilization in some form doesn't have to mean they remain exactly as they were. Cultures evolve. If the unknown civilization did persist, it might look very different now, shaped by centuries of adaptation and integration. The tools, materials, and even the social structures they use today might not resemble those of their peak. But the underlying thread, the core identity and knowledge, could still be there for those who know how to see it. And if they do still exist, it's possible they're aware of the outside world's interest in their past. They might even know more about the connections we've been speculating about than we do, but choose not to share. From their perspective, revealing the full story might not be worth the potential consequences. The idea that they could still be here doesn't require hidden cities or untouched islands. It only requires that some part of them, people, knowledge, traditions, continued in some form without being fully absorbed. They could be living alongside everyone else, their history unrecognized, their influence hidden in the details of everyday life. When we think about the legacy of a civilization, we often picture the obvious markers: towering ruins, inscriptions carved in stone, artifacts displayed in museums. These are the things that catch the eye and survive the centuries. But the influence of a people doesn't have to be monumental to be lasting. Sometimes it is the quiet details, embedded in the way we live and think, that carry forward their presence long after their name has been forgotten. If an unknown civilization once shaped the development of the cultures we know, much of what they left behind might not stand apart as something foreign. Instead, it would have blended into the everyday habits, tools, and patterns of life that later generations took for granted. A technique for storing grain that became the default across a region. A building method so practical it was never questioned. A way of navigating that became common knowledge among sailors without anyone remembering where it began. We live surrounded by such inheritances, most of them invisible to us because they've been with us for so long. The chair you sit in, the type of lock on your door, the arrangement of streets in your city, all of these have deep roots in decisions made long before your lifetime. In some cases, those roots may stretch back to cultures we know well. In others, they could trace to people we've never named. Cultural influence doesn't require large numbers. A small group, if it holds specialized knowledge, can have an outsized effect on a much larger population. Once their ideas are adopted, they can spread independently, evolving and adapting as they move. The origin point fades into the background, and the knowledge becomes part of the shared human toolkit. If a forgotten civilization passed on agricultural methods, certain crops, or techniques for managing the environment, those gifts could still be sustaining people today without any acknowledgement of where they came from. If they contributed to early systems of measurement, trade, or governance, traces of those systems might still be embedded in the way our institutions work. Languages carry these footprints too. Isolated words, place names, or grammatical structures that don't match the surrounding language. Families can be hints of an older influence. Even if the original language is gone, fragments can persist in everyday speech, unnoticed by the people using them. Belief systems and stories are another area where deep continuity can exist. Myths that seem purely symbolic might carry encoded knowledge about the movement of stars, the behavior of the sea, the cycles of weather. If these stories survive in multiple cultures with only minor variations, it could be because they were passed along by a shared source, repeated until their practical meaning faded but the narrative endured. Art and design can also preserve influence. Certain patterns, proportions, or motifs can persist for centuries, passed from artisan to apprentice without anyone realizing their deeper origin. In some cases, a decorative element might once have had symbolic or functional significance that is no longer understood, yet it continues to appear simply because it's seen as beautiful or traditional. Even in technology, there are cases where something becomes so standard that no one questions where it came from. A particular method of joining materials, a tool shape, a way of marking distances, all of these can survive through countless generations of improvement and variation. If the unknown civilization was truly widespread in its connections, their influence could be scattered in so many places that we can't see the pattern. It would be like trying to recognize a single voice in a crowded room where everyone has learned to speak in the same tone. This also raises the possibility that we've already found pieces of their world, but we've classified them as belonging entirely to other cultures. An artifact in one museum, a fragment of a story in another, a crop whose origin doesn't match its current location. Each piece makes sense on its own, but together they might reveal a larger story. Modern science is beginning to connect these dots more effectively. Advances in genetics, linguistics, and archaeology are allowing researchers to trace lineages of plants, animals, and ideas with greater precision. As these fields develop, they may reveal patterns of influence that point to a civilization not yet recognized in our historical record. But even if we never find definitive proof, the idea of a soft footprint matters. It reminds us that history is not only written in stone and metal, it's also written in the way we do things, the assumptions we make, and the invisible threads that link our daily lives to people who lived long before us. The unknown civilization, if it existed, might not have left behind a single structure we can point to. But if they shape the path of human development in ways that still affect us, then in a sense they are still here, not as a hidden city or a lost people waiting to be found, but as part of the foundation of the world we inhabit now. Thank you for spending this time exploring with me. If you've enjoyed this journey, there are many more paths we can walk together and many more questions to ask. Until next time, take care of yourself and keep wondering about the stories the world hasn't told us yet,